G'day legends, Jono here from Thermaltake Australia, and we're back on how to build your very first gaming PC. Last episode we started the build, but due to its mammoth length, we're back to finish it off today. After that, I'm going to take you through the next steps too, like installing Windows and drivers. But for now, let's get straight back into building Alice's PC. Alrighty, now that the motherboard is installed, it's a good time to connect all of our power cables for all of your hardware, which is where your power supply comes in. This is one of our Tough Power GF1s, which is a fully modular power supply. Now, if your power supply doesn't look like mine, don't stress. There are three types of power supplies: non-modular, semi-modular, and fully modular, which is what the GF1 is. Essentially, it means that the cables come with either all, some, or none of hard attached cables to the unit. Because ours have no cables attached, you will find them all in this little bag. This power supply is 650 watts, which is more than enough power for Alice's hardware, and also has a Gold 80+ rating. Let's dive into your cables. First, this is the CPU cable. One side will go into the power supply, and the other will go into the motherboard. The way to know which side is which is one side will split down the middle into two 4-pins, and the other side won't. Ours also do label which side you need to plug into the motherboard by labeling it, but in case yours doesn't, now you know the pro strat to figure it out. Next is the 24-pin cable. The side that plugs into your motherboard will be more commonly one big block of 24 pins, but sometimes a 20+4 pin. The other side that goes into the PSU will sometimes split into a small and large connector. The rest of these cables are technically optional, so you should just install which ones you need if you have a fully modular power supply. First up, we've got these SATA cables. These are often used for your hard drives, other peripherals like optical drives, and some RGB products. If you want to see a quick demonstration of plugging in your hard drives, jump to the timestamp on the screen. Next, we've got Molex. Now these are used to power things like RGB controllers. They aren't used all that often, but we do still rock them, so if you have any of our Thermaltake digital RGB stuff, you'll probably want to pop one of these in. Both Molex and SATA cables can go into a 4 or 6-pin connector on your PSU, so make sure you don't accidentally put them into a PCIe port. Remember to follow your PSU's manual in case you're not sure. Lastly, we have the PCIe cables, which you guessed it, go into a PCIe slot. Graphics cards can either use a 6 or 8-pin PCIe cable, or any combination of them up to 3 ports. PCIe cables from PSUs normally come as either a solid 6-pin, or more commonly nowadays a 6+2-pin cable, where the +2 is removable. The side you want to plug into the graphics card itself is the side that splits. The other goes into the power supply. For us, we only need one cable for the graphics card, so that's all we'll install. And lastly, for all you old farts like me, you might recognize these as floppy disk connectors. We actually have some support for this still with RGB connectors, which is why we include it, but for most instances you probably won't need it. You'll also need these little screws that came with the PSU, which we'll use to secure it into the case, so keep these safe for now. To kick the connecting off, we'll start with the CPU cable. As I mentioned earlier, this motherboard has two CPU connectors. We're using a standard CPU and we're not going to overclock it, so we'll just be using one 8-pin cable today. As you can see, the cable has a little alligator clip. Simply hold that down with your thumb and insert it into the top left of the motherboard. Next, let's do the 24-pin motherboard cable. Once again, hook that clip down and insert it here, just to the right of the board. It can be a little stiff, so give it a bit of a wriggle just to make sure it's all the way in. Now, let's get the PCIe cable ready for the graphics card. So we'll just route it through the grommet and leave it there. Next, let's prop the case up and get all of the cables back through the grommets, ready to be installed into the power supply. Let's begin plugging these in. I find it far easier to plug all of this in before the PSU is installed into the case. So start off by looking at the spot on the power supply where it says CPU and simply plug in your CPU cable there. Next, grab the 24 motherboard pin which splits into two and pop the longest bit across the top and the smaller one down the bottom. Feel free to pull back and separate the cables a little if you need a little bit more slack. Also, really make sure these cables are seated correctly, so give them a nice wiggle. Up next are the SATA and Molex cables. You can skip these if you don't have any need for them. Pop the Molex and SATA cables in the area that says PCIe plus peripherals. And then finish it off with the GPU PCIe in the one labelled GPU. Make sure the space under our PSU shroud is nice and clear. Slide in your PSU with the fan facing downwards so it'll intake cold air and push out the hot air towards the back of the case. It will take a bit of maneuvering, but eventually you should be able to line your PSU up with the holes on the outside of the case. Grab those 4 screws in the baggie from earlier and use your trusty Phillips head 2 screwdriver to secure the PSU inside the case. Now I'm quickly just jumping in here to show you how to install a hard drive if you don't have an M.2 like Alice does. Here I have a motherboard and a 3.5-inch traditional hard drive. The process is exactly the same if you have a 2.5-inch SSD. Grab your SATA data cable that comes with your motherboard and plug this into the second slot on the drive. This then loops around to the front of your motherboard and goes into one of the ports on the bottom right hand side of your motherboard. Grab your SATA cable that we installed just before into your PSU and plug that into the drive. Now, if you have an older generation or an entry-level board, you might find your drive is not picking up when it comes to installing Windows down the track. If you have an M.2 installed, it could be because the lane is shared by that M.2, so check with your motherboard if this is the case. But often, simply plugging into any port should work. Okay, this is the stage where you want to plug in everything for your front panel I/Os. But considering it is a bit of a hard thing to see, let's throw it back to Past Me to help. Take it away, Past Jono. G'day, it's me again, or is it me? Still. Whatever, let's go through connecting up your front I/O. We've cut them off a case to help demonstrate this a little easier. All of these are your front panel I/Os. They all have labels to make it a little easier for you. What we're going to do is install them into the header on the bottom right of your motherboard. You'll also notice there's often a little diagram that helps indicate where things go, as long as you can read size 2 font. Let's start off with the most important one, your power switch. This goes into the 3rd and 4th pin from the top left. Then we have the reset switch. The cool thing about the reset switch is it goes directly underneath the power switch. Now it's time for the power LED positive and negative. You can refer to the diagram here to see which place they go. The cool thing to remember is that the power LEDs will go on the same plane as your power switch and simply pop in next to each other. We're on the home stretch now and it's time for the hard drive LEDs. This will let you know if there's any hard drive activity on your PC. They simply go into the remaining 2 pins over here, and there you go. Now, you may notice that there are some additional pins on the connector, and I'm going to be honest with you, in 15 years of building PCs, I've never used them, so you probably won't need to either. Also, you might not actually have a power LED or a hard drive activity light on your case, so you don't need to plug those in, obviously, if you don't have them. Alrighty, that's all done. Let's move into a few other parts of the front panel connectors that I can show you easily from this position. So first, let's plug in the USB 3.0 header. This gets routed around the top and under the 24-pin cable into this slot right here, as I explained in the last episode. Next, this is the USB-C header located here. And now, let's do the front panel audio, which will always be located on the bottom left of the motherboard. I like to route this cable right at the back, as there's usually a little cutout underneath the motherboard. On this connector, there's a little square that is blocked out, so simply align the blocked spot with the pin that doesn't exist on the connector. We're almost at the home stretch now, but first we've got a few extra sweet fans for Alice to add some RGB goodness. If you don't have any other fans to install, feel free to skip ahead to the time on the screen. Open your fan boxes and take everything out. In our box of Pure Duos, we have the fans obviously, screws and a controller box, plus everything we need to connect that box to the motherboard. On the Divider 500, we've got this bracket up front which will be used to mount the fans onto. Simply extract the bracket, and if you're like us, remove any stock fans that are already there. Now's the time to have a quick think about airflow setup and direction. Grab your new fans and line them up where you want them to sit, taking note of airflow direction. Also, just like we did for mounting the fans on the all-in-one radiator, think about the direction you want your cables to face and make sure they're going towards the back. Once you're happy with how the fans are sitting, simply use the supplied screws and screw the fans onto the bracket. Once they are all on, nice and firmly, simply reinstall the bracket to the case. Of course, if you don't have a bracket, you would have just screwed these fans directly onto the case and some mounting holes. Now, to continue the USB installation, you're going to want to grab the cables to connect your RGB box with the USB 2.0 cable. This is going to go into the motherboard down here near your I/O headers. Route that through to the back and then connect this up to your RGB controller box. Lastly, to power your connector, grab the power cable and plug it directly into the control box here. The other side connects up with your Molex cables, which we installed into your PSU just before. This can be a little bit of an annoying cable to plug in, so just do your best to align the shapes as best as possible and push the cables together. If some of the pins pop out, don't fret, just carefully pop them back in. Now that the connector is powered up, simply plug all of those fan cables we've been routing through. This will now power and light up all of your fans. Finally, plug the USB micro cable into the control unit and you're done. I've also just chucked in some LEDs to add a little bit of extra lighting to this pretty dark case for Alice. If you don't have extra LEDs, once again, feel free to jump ahead to the next step. I'm using our Pacific Plus Lumi LED strips. With the Lumi strips, you'll receive 3 of these LED strips along with the LED cables so you can place them throughout your case. Or you can daisy chain them together to create a really long LED snake like so. They're also magnetic, which helps you install them into the case. I like to put them along the top and the sides where you can't exactly see them, but they still illuminate a lot of the case. So first, I'm going to connect them up and place them at the top here. I'm not going to remove the 3M tape as I'm not entirely set on it. So I'm just going to place it here for now. This here is an extremely important step to take note of. You need to align the 5V pin, which you can see right here, it'll say 5 volts on it, and you want to align that arrow from this cable to the 5V indicator. If you do it the wrong way, it can lead to something like a fire, as you'll be sending the current to the wrong place, so please be mindful. Alrighty, just flipping the case around now to show you where it'll connect. Here is our RGB controller box from before. Simply reach in and grab the cable from the LED strips and simply pop it into a spare slot. That is how you install our Pacific Plus Lumi LED strips. We've finally arrived at the main course, the moment everyone's been waiting for, installing the graphics card. We're going with a 3060 graphics card for Alice's build, which is pretty exciting. First, you want to remove these covers from the slots at the back. They're just there to protect your inputs. You can remove as many as you want or just leave the ones you won't be using in. Also, remember to remove the plastic from your GPU if you have a brand new one like we do for Alice. There'll usually be some at the top and sides you should remove. You'll also need to remove the PCIe protector, this small plastic thing here, as well as the back sticker on this one in particular, as it will get quite toasty. Just to give you a quick tour of your GPU, this is where you'll find your front fans. We also have your inputs here, where you'll plug in your monitors. And over here are the power connectors, and on this model, we only have 1x8 pin connector where your power supply plugs into. You also have your backplate with your BIOS switch here, which is currently in performance mode, and that's where we'll leave it. Okay, let's install it now. The first step is to grab your screwdriver and remove 2 of these PCIe brackets. You'll want to remove the second and third ones most of the time, as they tend to be the spots that align with the PCIe slot. If you want to double check, simply grab your GPU and align the teeth of the PCIe express lane with the socket in the motherboard, hovering over it while taking note of what brackets align with your GPU. Sometimes this is 2, 3, and in weird, unique cases, 4. Now traditionally, the motherboard PCIe lane will also have a small latch that you will need to open to allow your graphics card to slide in, similar to your RAM. If yours has that, of course also remember to do that before moving any further. Alice's motherboard is fancy and doesn't have one of those, so I don't need to do that. Now with your screwdriver, remove the brackets that you have decided you need to. With this specific case, we also need to remove an additional bracket, as this case usually allows you to rotate your GPU if you want. So I'm also just going to remove that quickly, but if you don't have to, simply skip this step. Now this is pretty much the same for all modern GPU installations. Align the teeth of the GPU with the PCIe bracket, and with a gentle push, slide it into place. Sometimes you might hear a little click as the latch sits in place, but in this instance we won't. Now place back that extra bracket if you also have a divider 500 and thread the screws you removed earlier from the PCIe brackets and use them again to secure the GPU. I also usually support the GPU with my other hand while screwing it in place just to keep it steady. The heavier the graphics card, the more likely it will sag, but that's completely normal. The last step is to grab the PCIe cable we threaded through earlier and insert the cable into the power ports on the GPU. In this instance, we have a 6+2 pin and we need to make it into an 8 pin. So simply slide the 2 pin section through the top here and hold it in place as it will not lock in. Now just push it into the GPU. It'll only go in one way, so don't force it because you've probably got it the wrong way around. Now before jumping into the cable management process, let's plug in our case fans. As you can see, we have this back fan here that isn't plugged in yet, as well as our all-in-one fans that need a home. So I've moved the case on its back to help illustrate this a little better. Now it's really up to you which port to use. For this back case fan, you can pop it into any of these ports like the system fan or channel fan, but this time I've elected to pop it into the CPU optional port. This port is tied to the CPU temps, so that means it'll speed up and slow down depending on the CPU temperatures. For the all-in-one fan splitter, I'm just going to plug that into a system fan header. The all-in-one fans can basically go into any of these ports, but I personally like to use a system fan header so I can change the voltage in the motherboard BIOS and also for cable management purposes. So with all of that done, you're basically at the end of your build. Congratulations, you did it! And I couldn't be any more proud of you. To just finish it off, I'm going to go ahead and do a bit of cable management. Now, if you've spent any time on this channel, you would know that I'm often given some lip about my cable management or lack thereof, so I won't spend ages here. Instead, I'll recommend our extensive cable management guide we created with our pro PC builder Nick, who's far better at it than me. But while we watch this sped up version of me cable managing, here are a few little tidbits that might come in handy for you. Personally, I like to have the case on its side as it's far easier to deal with cables and zip them to the case itself. My first principle is that I like to minimize permanent decisions. So wherever I can, if I don't have to cable tie to the case itself, then I won't. The reason being, in case I'm going to swap things out, which I often do. So if you think it'll be the same, then feel free to follow the same principle. I will often just bunch up cables and grab a table tie, reduce the slack where I can, and then push that to the side. Also, taking advantage of the space you have is a good idea. For example, as Alice isn't using any hard drives, I will stuff a bunch of cables in there instead. When it comes to PSU cables, keep in mind that your SATA and Molex cables do need to be more accessible, so I tend to keep them free and loose where I can. But things like your CPU, GPU, and motherboard pins, I'll often cable tie to the case as they don't often move. I will then cable tie other cables to those and not the case, so do remember you can cable tie cables to other cables. They don't always need to be tied to the case itself. For me, the goal of cable management isn't always about having the best looking cables on the back of the case, it's more about being the most accessible for you, so keep that in mind too. After all, once the back panel is back on, who's gonna know anyway?
Alrighty, so that is the build completed. Now, I might hear you saying, but Jono, why are you still here then? Well, sweet summer child, if you think you simply need to put everything together, plug it in and go, then you are entirely wrong. So before I let you and your wonderful new PC go off into the wilds and game to your heart's content, here are a few final things you need to do. So I'm back with our system because it's time to go through installation. Now this will not be the PC's final home or monitors, as of course it will be heading across the pond over to Alice once we're done. So just keep that in mind while I do this. First off, let's start with the big one, Windows. That's right, your operating system doesn't just magically appear once you've built your PC, you'll always need to install it. And there are two main ways to go about doing this. First, you can grab yourself a USB of at least 16 gigabytes and another computer if you have one handy, like a laptop. Then head on over to the Microsoft website and download the Windows of your choice. Now, you simply insert the USB into your new PC and turn it on. It should now detect the Windows copy on your USB. Simply follow the prompts and boom, your Windows will be installed. If you don't have access to another PC to download it from, don't fret. Retailers will also sell USBs that come with Windows installed on it, so you can just buy that and pop it in. Alrighty, next up is to enable XMP or AMP. Now this allows your RAM to actually run at the speeds it's advertised at, because otherwise it'll default to the base speed of DDR4 RAM, which is 2334. So to do this, the first step is going to be getting into your BIOS. Now it will differ depending on your motherboard, but often the button you'll want to hit is the delete key or the F12 key. As soon as you boot up your PC, smack that delete button until you find yourself into the PC's BIOS. Now, if you have a different motherboard, your screen will no doubt look different to mine here. And on this motherboard, there is both an easy mode and an advanced mode. It's pretty obvious here in the simple or the easy mode where to enable XMP. You just look in the left-hand corner here and click here to enable the Profile 1. Over in the advanced mode, however, it's a little bit more daunting, but you do need to just look for Extreme Memory Profile or XMP, and it's pretty much the same. Double click on the title and it should boot up a little menu here. And if this is all the BIOS action you want to have in your life, simply select save and you're done. Congratulations, you have overclocked your RAM, and you can now tell all of your friends how much of a hacker man you are. Now, this next step you'll not need to do if you have an AMD CPU, but as Alice has an Intel chip, we will want to do this. If you don't have a new Intel CPU, feel free to skip ahead, or if you have AMD, you don't really need to listen to this. Now, what I want to do is remove the CPU power limit on this chip. On the 11th and 12th gen Intel chipset release, motherboards have an inbuilt power limiter to reduce the output of the newer CPUs, as they do provide a lot more heat if they boost, which allows them to perform at their best. Each motherboard manufacturer will have a different setting they will call it, but it is just essentially a power limit. So in order to do this, navigate over to where your BIOS allows you to input what type of CPU fan you have and simply put that in. You might also have a board which simply says something along the lines of CPU power limiter, and you just simply need to turn this off. On this Gigabyte board, we are still in the advanced settings mode, so we're just looking for a setting here like CPU upgrade in this case. It's set to default, but what we want to do is go up one and choose max performance profile. We are using a 240 all-in-one, so there's nothing that we really need to worry about when it comes to thermals. Alrighty, now we're out of the BIOS and back into the less terrifying part of the PC. First off, if you have any sort of additional storage outside of your OS drive that you have installed Windows on, you will need to initialize it. And to do that, you need to go over to the Start menu and go right click on it and look for Disk Management. In here, you will be prompted with a menu. Basically, all you need to do is have disk 1 selected, make sure GPT is selected, click OK, and it will register the drive. Right click on the unallocated space, click New Simple Volume, follow the prompts, assign your drive a letter, click Next, make sure it's NTFS unless you know about different format systems, use default, change the name, click Next, Finish, and your new drive will be initialized and you can access that in this PC area. Next, it's time to install your graphics card drivers. Get onto the internet and head on over to either AMD or Nvidia's sites depending on your card. If you are having issues connecting, it's possible your Ethernet drivers are not installed, so you might need to suss that out first. Grab a laptop or borrow your mate's PC and download the drivers for your motherboard to a USB. Anyways, back to the graphics drivers. Once you are online, simply navigate to your selected drivers. Once you've made it to the website, simply select your card and download the latest drivers for it. Make sure you select either Windows 11 if that's what you installed, or Windows 10 specific drivers, and if there is a 32-bit or 64-bit version, make sure you download the appropriate one there too. You can tell by the names at the top here, with the Adrenaline software, it is pretty universal. It's going to work on 32 and 64-bit systems, so it's not too much of a worry, but that's just something to keep in mind. While you are installing your graphics card drivers, your monitor may go black every now and then, and that is totally normal. Make sure you keep these drivers updated regularly so you don't run into any weird graphic issues. Now, once your GPU drivers are installed, it might be worth checking the refresh rate of your monitor. As this is not the monitor Alice will be using, I won't play around too much here, but jumping into your display settings over down here, making your way down to advanced display settings, you can check out the refresh rate and the resolution of your monitor. Currently, it's at 1920 by 1080p and 60 Hz. However, if you come down to the refresh rate, you'll get a drop-down menu. And once your drivers are fully installed and you have a high refresh rate monitor like this, you'll be able to select up to 144 Hz on this monitor specifically. Don't worry, the screen will go black as it resets the settings. Click Keep Changes, and there you go. You now have 144 Hz and you're displaying at 1920 by 1080 on this monitor. And you can see the difference is quite substantial. These next few things I'm going to rattle off are just some recommendations for programs that might make your PC journey smoother. You absolutely don't need to use any of these if you don't want to. Now for me, I always install GPU Tweak 3 for Nvidia cards. This is just a program that gives you one-click solutions to overclock your GPU. You also don't have to use this with just specifically ASUS cards, as any card manufacturer will do. Sorry ASUS. However, if you are on Team Red, then you can use AMD's Adrenalin Suite, which does a similar thing but is a little bit more in depth, allowing you to specifically overclock your GPU depending on the program you have open. That does mean if you have a favorite game, you can have settings for that game or a program, or you can have it do nothing at all, prolonging its lifespan when you're just doing day-to-day tasks. You can still use ASUS GPU Tweak for AMD cards as well, if you find the Adrenalin Suite a little bit harder to use. Lastly, I'd recommend the ASUS AI Suite. Included in the AI Suite is a piece of software called Fan Expert. It is a fan controlling software where you can manually control your fan speeds. I'd recommend using it to bring your fan noise level down, because these boys can get loud if left to their own devices. It's also far more user-friendly than trying to tweak your fans in the BIOS via voltage settings. So I think after all of that hard work, it's about time we saw some sweet B-roll of Alice's new PC, don't you? Let's roll it. And there we have it. We have officially built a new gaming PC for Alice. And if you have built alongside me, perhaps you've even built your own too. I really do hope this series has been able to help you make the concept of building your very first gaming PC one that sounds far less scary and less daunting than it seems to be for many first-time builders. I also hope I've been able to give you some tips and tricks you haven't heard of before to make the process even smoother for you. We do also have a bunch of other educational PC building content worth checking out on the channel already, as well as even more to come. So please, if you have enjoyed this series, I'd really appreciate you taking the time to subscribe to our channel and maybe even leave a cheeky comment down below letting us know. We put a lot of time and effort into this series, many late nights staying in the office after close, so we would really appreciate all the love you can spare to send our way if you did enjoy it. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video. Happy building and happy gaming. Peace out, Brussels sprout.